Chapter 18. Percy's Parchment. "Renier declared you dead," Ava explained, stepping back from her embrace to look at Chris's face. "You vanished into the woods and never came back. Several guards said they were certain one of the crocodiles had injured your leg. We all thought—" "I would never return," Chris completed. Ava nodded sadly. "I've missed you," she said softly. "And I don't even know you." She chuckled as she wiped the tears from her cheek. Chris looked her in the eye and smiled. "I've missed you," he said, "and I have so much to tell you." He related to her everything that had transpired from the time he escaped from the castle, the elves in their village, King Wenceslas and his injuries, the daily talks, and unexpected coronation. "He named you king?" Ava asked in disbelief. Chris nodded, giving her a moment to think about all that he had told her. I don't know what to say," she admitted, her eyes reflecting the overwhelm of emotions she was feeling. "Believe me, I don't know what to say either, and I certainly don't know what to do," Chris confided. "But you and I both know that Renier must be stopped. He hasn't taken the throne yet, has he?" Ava shook her head. "Not officially, though he considers himself the king already by how he acts and orders others," she explained. "The coronation ceremony is scheduled to take place the day after tomorrow. I know it has pained him to wait this long already, but since Father's body never turned up, he knew he could not rush into a coronation without arousing suspicion. He is purposely scheduling it after the funeral, so as to give the appearance that he is honoring the late king." She grabbed Chris's hand. "But we don't have to worry about that now," she said with a smile. "You are the king." The smile on Ava's face was greeted with a frown on Chris's. "Our troubles are far from over, Ava," he reminded her. "Renier will not go down without a fight, and if he is indeed the beast you claim him to be, then there is no telling what a man who is willing to murder his own father would do to keep his power. I fear these next 2 days could bring about a great war in Silverbell if we are not careful." "What's your plan, then?" Ava asked earnestly. "Jump down the chimney?" Chris laughed as he grabbed Ava's lantern. "I'll show you the plan," he said, "but you first must show me your great-great-grandfather." Ava gave him a bewildered look. "Excuse me?" she replied with a chuckle. "Grinkers told me where to find Percy's parchment," Chris added. "Grinkers, the elf," Ava verified, recalling the stories Chris had told her earlier. "Yes, the same. His father was Percy, as in Percy's parchment," Chris continued excitedly. "He explained to me what was meant by the phrase you overheard your brother say about the parchment dying with the king. The king is your great-great-grandfather. Percy's parchment was buried with him to prevent others from abusing its power." "What power?" Ava asked with interest. Chris smiled. "Point to the casket, and I'll show you." Ava led him to a beautifully decorated casket near the entrance of the tomb. It was mostly made of silver, with a large red star engraved on the top cover piece and a forest of trees engraved along the sides. Chris handed Ava the lantern and removed the top piece from the casket, doing so carefully to show both respect to the dead and to prevent any loud noises. Ava shone the light over the open casket. The light revealed a skeleton, clothed in royal robes, with a crown still hanging on the head. An unpleasant, musky odor reached their nostrils, and Ava had to step back for a moment, the whole experience being too much for her senses. Chris looked quickly but carefully around what was left of the deceased king. He checked the pockets of his robes, and even gently raised the skeleton to look at the bottom of the casket. There was no sign of the parchment. Chris stared at the open casket, not hiding the disappointment he felt. "It's not here," he stated dejectedly. "I worry that Lord Renier has already—" He stopped, for his eye caught something it had missed before. The handles which protruded from the sides, which the casket bearers would use to carry the deceased, all matched the silver that made up the exterior of the casket. All, that is, except for the handle at the foot of the casket, the handle upon which Chris's eyes now rested. It was made of gold, and on either end of the handle were silver knobs, each with an evergreen tree engraved upon its face. "Felix had told me that the elves see evergreen trees as the ultimate symbol of life," Chris explained to Ava as he examined more closely the knobs of the handle. "To them, these trees embody endurance, strength, and immortality." He grabbed hold of the knob nearest him and began to turn it. He continued turning it until the knob removed itself from the threading within the handle. Chris held the lantern up against the opening of the handle and smiled widely. He reached his fingers inside the hollow cylinder and removed a piece of thick parchment that had been rolled up tightly inside. The parchment itself did not look as old as it was, and it seemed to Chris to be exuding a faint glow in the darkness. "That's it?" Ava asked excitedly. "Let's see," he said with a boyish grin. However, the grin disappeared as he realized neither of them possessed pen or ink. "It's supposed to answer the questions you write upon it." "You test it tonight, then," Ava told him. "I must be returning to the castle anyways. Will I see you tomorrow?" "You will see St. Nicholas tomorrow," he reminded her. Ava helped Chris return the cover to the casket. They made their way to the stone steps, but paused before ascending them. A soft drizzle of rain began to fall, making the cold night air even chillier. The two stood at the tomb's opening, under the cover of the dirt ceiling above them. "You'll be okay by yourself?" Chris asked with concern. "Oh yes," Ava assured him. "I have made this walk many times before, even in the rain. Besides, it would probably not be appropriate for a priest to be seen walking home a princess late at night." Chris smiled. He looked up and out at the rain, and as he did so, he saw a clustering of mistletoe hanging over the edge of the tomb's opening, growing out of the soil above them. "You know," he said, gesturing for Ava to look up, "it's a tradition to share a kiss when standing under mistletoe." Ava laughed. "Oh, really?" she asked playfully. "I don't ever recall hearing about that tradition." She leaned in, placed her hand upon his cheek, and kissed him. "It might be a tradition I made up just now," Chris confessed with a smile, the two staring deeply into each other's eyes. "I'm glad you did," Ava said, and the two shared one more long kiss before she replaced the hood on her head. "Good night, Your Majesty," Chris said softly. "Good night, my king," Ava replied with a smile. She ran out into the rain toward the castle, and after she was out of sight, Chris made his way back inside the church and snuck upstairs to his room. The rain was starting to come down a little harder, and Chris worried that Ava might be stuck in the weather. As he sat upon his bed, he remembered the piece of magical parchment in his pocket. He removed it and placed it on the desk. Taking the feather pen out of the ink bottle that was sitting on the desk, he wrote down a simple question to test the parchment's ability. "Where is Kris Kringle?" he wrote on the parchment. Beneath his question, in perfect handwriting, appeared the answer. "The upper room of Silver Bells Church." Chris gasped. He had never seen such magic before, and he was almost frightened by it. He scratched out the question, and as he did so, both the question and answer vanished from the parchment. "Is Princess Ava safely back at the castle?" he wrote down quickly, his concern for her well-being still on his mind. The answer appeared. Yes. Chris smiled and began preparing himself for bed, content that the parchment worked just as Grinkers had claimed it would. As badly as Chris wanted to write down a series of questions, he promised himself not to get carried away. The purpose of getting Percy's parchment, after all, was to keep it out of the hands of Prince Rainier. If Chris was not careful, he too could become corrupted by its power. He tucked the parchment into the pocket of his robe and kept it close to his bed. He laid there for nearly an hour, unable to sleep. All he could think about was his evening with Ava, the kiss they had shared, and the great adventure and dangers that yet awaited them both. Never in all his life would he have dreamed of falling in love with a princess. He lay there wondering if she too was lying awake thinking of him. He looked over at the parchment that was barely sticking out of the pocket, softly glowing in the darkness. Chris could not resist. He rose from his bed, grabbed the pen and parchment, and wrote down one more question. He hesitated at first to write it down, for the question was bold, even premature, and he was scared of what the answer would be. But he had to know. Will Kris Kringle marry Princess Ava? He waited breathlessly for the answer to appear. When it did, his heart sank to his stomach. The magical feelings of that evening seemed to vanish in an instant. One word shone on the parchment in response to his query. No.